4. Gloworm vs. Admiral Hipper. On April 8, 1940, off the coast of Norway, the British destroyer HMS Gloworm engaged in a fierce naval battle with the German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, marking one of the most brutal naval actions of World War II. HMS Gloworm, a G-class destroyer, was initially deployed during the Spanish Civil War to enforce neutrality. In 1938, she joined the Mediterranean Fleet, but was later transferred back to England in anticipation of the impending conflict. In April 1940, Gloworm was involved in Operation Wilfred, a mine-laying operation aimed at deterring German naval forces while they prepared to invade Norway. KMS Admiral Hipper, a German heavy cruiser, had been commissioned in April 1939 and was part of the invasion force for Norway. The two ships' paths crossed when Gloworm was escorting the British battlecruiser HMS Renown, and dense fog obscured the vessels. Gloworm initially mistook Admiral Hipper for a friendly ship, allowing the German cruiser to close in and open fire. During the intense battle that followed, Gloworm suffered significant damage, losing her forward gun and other key parts of the ship. Despite her dire situation, Lieutenant Commander Gerald Broadmead Roop, Gloworm's captain, refused to surrender. Instead, he chose to fight to the end. Roop launched a barrage of torpedoes at close range, which Admiral Hipper narrowly avoided. And in the midst of this maneuver, Gloworm collided with the much larger German cruiser, causing significant harm to the ship. Despite the damage, the crew of Gloworm continued to fire back until their ship eventually sank. Roop's courageous actions earned him a posthumous Victoria Cross, the highest British military decoration. Admiral Hipper survived the encounter and continued to serve until 1945. The Battle of the Gloworm demonstrated the determination and bravery of the British military, leaving a lasting impression on the Germans and earning their respect for the tenacity of the small but defiant British nation. 3. The Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was an exhaustive and fierce battle between the Allied powers and the Axis powers from 1939 until 1945, when Germany surrendered. The Allied powers hoped to free the Atlantic and the seas around Europe, and their plan included blockading Germany. The Axis powers wanted nothing more than to disrupt the Atlantic and surrounding seas to make shipping of supplies more difficult. But the Allies knew that allowing the Axis powers to win the Battle of the Atlantic would be a major disaster in their war efforts. When the fighting began in 1939, the British and French worked together to fight the Germans in the Atlantic and the seas that surrounded Europe. The British and French were able to create a blockade that prevented German naval movements, but this victory was short-lived. The Germans were successful on the European continent, and they scored a shocking blow in 1940 when they rolled through Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The British were facing their own problems with the Germans at Dunkirk, a city in northern France. The British were desperate to get their forces across the English Channel to be home and defend Britain, which had been under attack from the German Luftwaffe, or German Air Force. These problems allowed Germany to have an upper hand, and in 1940, Italy made things far more difficult by siding with Germany. Italy and Germany were able to cause problems in the Mediterranean, and they also made things impossible for the British at the Suez Canal. The British had their backs against the wall, and things were looking absolutely bleak at times. The Germans hoped their U-boats or submarines would cut off the English Channel and stop all supplies coming into Britain, and their hope was to starve the country. However, the British weren't going to surrender. They pushed back and received help in 1941, when Canada sent ships and planes over for assistance in the war effort. This allowed for a safer transatlantic convoy for the Allies. And another big victory for the Allies was the sinking of the German battleship Bismarck. The Bismarck was Nazi Germany's pride and joy battleship. It was launched in 1939 and was supposed to be their most feared weapon on the seas. The Bismarck was heavily clad and had some impressive firepower. It was also the first battleship built by Germany since World War I. It measured over 800 feet, 244 meters, and had a crew of over 2,000 officers and enlisted men. In May 1941, the Bismarck was given the mission to destroy ships that were bringing valuable supplies from the United States to Great Britain. Operation Rheinübung was the code name for this mission. The British were aware of this mighty ship and sent out a search and destroy team. However, the Bismarck made zero impact on the Battle of the Atlantic because the ship was destroyed by the British. Another issue the Axis powers faced was the involvement of the United States. Around 1941, the US sent some of their World War I battleships to Britain, and they also deployed their ships to areas of the North Atlantic like Iceland and Greenland. The United States naval vessels also protected ships traveling to and from the US. Germany made a critical decision in 1941 that would backfire. They chose to invade the Soviet Union. Germany and the Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact in the 1930s, but Germany decided to surprise attack the Soviet Union and take them out. The Germans would be stuck in a difficult and frustrating battle with the Soviet Union from 1941 until 1942. The Germans also had to move ships toward the Soviet Union at various locations. The United States declared war on Japan in December 1941, and Germany and Italy declared war against the US that same month. Germany attacked US convoy vessels in the Atlantic and did enough damage to frustrate the Americans. The US sent ships to the North Atlantic and to the Mediterranean for support. Meanwhile, the Canadians were able to defend positions close to the US, Canada, and other locations that were deemed important. By 1943, the Allies had pushed Germany boats back in the Atlantic. The fighting was still fierce, and the struggle included North Africa and the Mediterranean. As the fighting continued from 1944 until 1945, the Germans were getting pushed back and facing multiple defeats on land and the sea. The United States would face naval battles in the Atlantic and the Pacific. And the same can be said about the British. The Canadian Navy patrolled portions of the Canadian and US waters. There are some great stories of what happened in the Atlantic theater when it comes to naval warfare. Some of these battles occurred in the North Sea and the Baltic Sea between 1941 and 1945. What's your favorite World War II era vessel? Let us know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. 2. A tricky situation. In World War I, the United States provided supplies to the British. However, the US would eventually enter that war to turn the tide in favor of Britain and their allies. World War II saw something similar with the United States. In 1939, the US passed the Neutrality Act that stated that American ships weren't permitted to carry any water material that was purchased with cash by belligerent countries. 2 years later, the United States passed the Lend-Lease Act of 1941 that stated that the US was permitted to lend or lease war supplies to nations vital to the defense of the United States. Merchant mariners on the seas were some of the first Americans to see combat during World War II. Their ships were attacked by the Germans in the Atlantic. One incident involved a ship called the SS Charles Pratt, which was torpedoed by a German U-boat off the coast of Africa in 1940. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt decided to build specific cargo ships that could hold war material. These were called Liberty ships, and within a year, the United States allowed their merchant ships to be armed. But even though they were armed, German U-boats still attacked. A Japanese submarine sank a US vessel in the Pacific on December 7, 1941. This wasn't a military ship at Pearl Harbor, but a merchant ship transporting lumber. As the United States entered World War II, merchant vessels were taken over by the War Shipping Administration, and their role was to serve as a temporary war agency responsible for acquiring control over and operating all American merchant vessels other than those assigned to the Army and Navy. According to the National World War II Museum, in 1942, the United States dispatched 350 vessels as members of Allied convoys in the Atlantic, leading to the Germans sinking almost 100 ships and causing the loss of numerous sailors and naval gunners' lives. 1. The Mirm Run. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1942, the Soviets asked the Allies for supplies in their war efforts. 2 ports that the Allies could get to were Archangel and Murmansk. These Soviet port cities weren't in the easiest of locations. They were in the frigid waters of the Barents Sea, which is located in the Arctic Ocean. Transportation ships full of supplies were escorted by Allied ships. The trip would be across the North Atlantic, where it would head in the direction of the Arctic Ocean. The weather posed an issue, and there was the obvious danger of ice. However, Germany had occupied Norway and was using the Scandinavian country and had ships and planes there ready to attack Allied vessels. Mines had also been placed in the sea, so the journey was treacherous. This was no easy task. There were dangers going to these Soviet port cities like Murmansk. But once they reached their destination, things still weren't safe. In fact, ships could be attacked in the harbor by U-boat or by air. Then there was the journey home, which was just as difficult. Those who braved the waters lived on edge, and the threat of constant attack was always there. To better understand the dangers of these voyages, one can review the German attack on convoy PQ-17 during the summer of 1942. Some 35 merchant ships were followed by 11 escort vessels. They'd set sail from Iceland and were headed to the port of Archangel with important supplies for the Soviets. However, PQ-17 dealt with an attack from the Germans once they got close to Norway. German aircraft and vessels, along with difficult weather conditions, made life for PQ-17 a living nightmare. The attacks seemed to be a constant issue, and the Germans were able to sink 12 of the 35 merchant vessels in just one day. Then, to make matters even worse, 2 battleships were called away. Another problem arose when the remaining escort vessels were contacted to seek a big German battleship that was sent out to destroy the convoy. The convoy of merchant ships were left to fend for themselves, and they were told to scatter to avoid German attacks. The convoy was separated, and it was an incredibly tense and dangerous trip for the rest of the way. Only 11 of the merchant vessels made their way to Archangel. It was a major loss of supplies and human lives. In total, some 153 people died during the ordeal. What was frustrating for the British is that the ships that were called away to deal with a massive German battleship discovered it was false information. The Allies faced an incredibly tough battle, and important supplies were lost. Convoy PQ-18 was the next convoy sent to the Soviet Union. Their journey began on September 2, 1941, when they left Loch Ewe, Scotland, for the Soviet Union. Like PQ-17, they were headed for Archangel, and there were 40 merchant ships with an equal number of escort ships. From September 12th until September 21st, the ships were attacked by German planes and ships. Some floating mines in the seas also caused a great deal of damage. The Germans were able to take down 13 of the merchant ships. But this attack came at a cost for the Germans. They lost somewhere between 24 and 44 aircraft, as well as 4 U-boats. A storm made things more difficult for convoy PQ-18 because it caused some of the ships to run aground. This, of course, slowed down the convoy, but the ships were rescued. It was December 1942 when an Allied convoy left Loch Ewe, Scotland for Murmansk. There were approximately 15 transport ships carrying a variety of supplies from aircraft to armored vehicles and from food to fuel. These supplies were desperately needed by the Soviets, and the Allies were ready to get those supplies to them, come hell or high water. Those 15 ships were under the protection of the British Royal Navy. According to an article from Warbird Fanatics, the British Royal Navy's fleet was composed of 6 destroyers, 2 light cruisers, 2 corvettes, 2 trawlers, and a minesweeper. As the ships moved north toward the Norwegian Sea, they hit a particularly nasty storm, throwing some of the ships off course. It was important for the transport ships to get back with the British fleet because they were sitting ducks if spotted by the Germans. But the Germans were in occupied Norway, and a U-boat near Altenfjord spotted the fleet and the transport ships. The U-boat radioed in the information, causing every available German ship to attack the British fleet and the transportation vessels. This was just the beginning of a major battle. It was no surprise that the Germans were looking for this convoy. It was all part of Operation Regenbogen, otherwise known as Operation Rainbow. This was a plan of Germany's to attack the Allied ships in the area on their way to Murmansk. Their orders were to take out the Allied ships, but they weren't supposed to take any unnecessary risks. Eventually, the transportation ships and the British fleet were reunited. It was a major sigh of relief for both the transportation ships and the fleet. The Germans were still on the hunt, though. The British spotted 2 German vessels not that long after they were spotted by the U-boat, prompting the Germans to open fire. But the British laid down a smoke screen so the transports wouldn't be visible to German battleships. The battle turned out to be a victory for the British, since they didn't lose a single transportation vessel. However, the British lost 3 ships and 250 individuals were killed. The Germans, on the other hand, lost 2 ships as well as 330 men. But in the end, the transportation convoy made its way to Murmansk and the supplies were unloaded for the Soviets. It's reported that this incident infuriated the Germans, and they changed their attacks to U-boats only. The efforts of defending transportation ships across the Atlantic Ocean is overlooked in World War II history. Many merchants risked their lives working on unarmed ships to deliver supplies to the Soviet Union. Enemy aircraft, battleships, and U-boats were hunting these vessels. Sometimes the vessels made it safely, but other times they were sunk in the Atlantic or Arctic Oceans, coming to rest at the bottom of the sea. Do you know any other stories of bravery on the seas you'd like us to make a video about? Let us know down below in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.